is the main part of the session today, is to look at what are the tools or records that you use to do these processes. What do you use to document your debits and credits? What tools do you use to ensure that you are able to reconcile your accounts and you have the proper opening and closing balances to show? Okay, so these are sort of the common pieces that you should have in place. These are pretty standard, and these would be the kinds of documents that an auditor or a partner who's looking to do a spot check, say, of payments or expenses related to a project that they have funded. These are what they're going to be looking for every debit that you have in your account. Okay. The first is a payment voucher. You may have these in place and be calling them something else. It might be an expense record. It could be an expense report, but a payment voucher is fairly common. It might be a journal voucher that you may be referring to. But these are the documents. The vouchers are used to itemize the expenses for any payment. So it would usually have line items that show the amount. Usually it should be reference which budget line or which project account those funds were coming from. And it should also have attached to it any corresponding invoices or receipts that show that that expense has been, that payment has been made for those items. Okay, so an audit of a payment voucher would be looking to see, is there documentation attached that matches the itemized list of payments or expenses or purchases that are indicated on the payment voucher. So this is a sample here of a voucher. You can see there is space there for the date. There's a numbering system that you can use, and every organization is going to have their own numbering system. They might indicate which year and the number of the voucher. It may just be a running list that gets longer and longer over the years. Either is fine. That's up to each organization. There's a place to describe what the expense is, a place to indicate the budget code or budget line that expense is coming from, and then the amount that was spent. Okay. At the bottom, there is a place to show the total for that whole voucher. And there's a place at the very bottom to show who has prepared that payment voucher, who has reviewed it, and who has approved it. Okay. Now, this again, every organization or every project is going to have different their own policies around who is able to approve payments, right? Or who is able to do the verification. Maybe that you have a treasurer or a bookkeeper position within your group, and that would be that person who's reviewing. You may have a supervisor or a manager, overall project manager, who needs to sign off on expenses before they can be made. But there usually should be a check where the person who's submitting the voucher has that voucher reviewed by a second person to make sure that it's accurate and that the backup documentation is there.
Now, we have a couple of questions in the chat box for this
okay.
to take them.
Okay.
First is, how do you handle payments without vouchers? Say someone paid out on their own but didn't get a receipt. What do you think of that?
Well, that would be, I think, partly would be something to be decided, that would be decided by each individual organization. I would suggest that limiting the incidence of people making payments without some sort of documentation is crucial. And obviously there are expenses, especially when you're doing field work, that can't always be backed up with a receipt. So usually I would suggest that you have some sort of policy or internal understanding of what to do with that in that case. For me, what I recommend to projects is that if there are, say, getting a boda ride, if you're, getting from needing transportation, or buying snacks, or, something like that from a roadside vendor, they're not going to give you a receipt. That's completely understandable. What I might do is make sure that you have some sort of documentation that you say on this date, at that time. Ideally, there would be a second person who could verify that expense has been made. But generally speaking, those expenses should be relatively minimal and relatively low in terms of the cost, the size of the expense. Generally for any larger expense, if you're buying stationery or supplies, you should be able to get a receipt, or at least to have something handwritten that someone can sign to say, yes, we've accepted these funds. And it's the same thing if you're giving payment to an individual, and you're using your cash from your cash account to do that. An example I could think of is you're running a training, for example, and you have offered travel reimbursement for the community members who have come to the training, and you would be giving that out in cash. I've seen projects use just a record where you've got the list of names and people initial or sign beside to say that they have received the funds. Mark, has that covered the kinds of situations that you had in mind? Okay, awesome. Thank you. That's a good question. Was there anything else? Any other question, Katie?
Yes, there is. First of all, everyone's seeing the screen now, no problem.
Okay.
And second is a question from Irfan in Indonesia. Hello, welcome.
Oh, hi.
Right now, Irfan is recording transactions with Excel just single entry. Do you think that's accurate? Is that clear enough, or do you want Irfan to unmute and explain the question more?
So I think that, yeah, entering expenses in Excel is a good practice, and I think we'll get to that. But I think that I think having paper documents is also important, because you will have, receipts and things that you're going to have to store somewhere. And maybe you're very tech forward, so maybe you're scanning or taking digital copies of receipts, and that's okay. But then I would still have a document like a journal voucher or a payment voucher that goes with each set of receipts. So it's really kind of a way of bundling expenses together and doing a little bookkeeping on a set of expenses so that you could put that aside. So it's sort of an alternative to having, say, just a big pile of receipts that are all accounted for in one place, because that can get unwieldy to be able to sort through later, and in order to verify and remember who was the person who made that expense, or there's a receipt missing and you don't know what the corresponding expense is. So I do think that entering expenses in Excel is a good way of keeping, say, a ledger, which is the overall running total and the running view of your expenses, but I don't think it's enough on its own. That's clear. That said, if you want to do your vouchers in Excel and use digital signatures, if you have that capacity to use technology and do it all digitally, that's also, I think, totally fine. Anything else on the vouchers? Just looking at the chat. Mark has something. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay. Yeah, I was looking for the button. So would you put in a total of an amount, like for instance, if something was like $100 plus tax 13, would you put the whole 113 there, or would you break it up into two lines?
It depends on how it really depends on the country, and it depends on how you account for taxes in each country. So here in Canada, we are able to request reimbursement for some of the taxes that we pay if we are a charity. So in Canada, we would separate out the purchase amount and the tax amount, because we have to report on that separately to the government. So it depends in whichever country you're in. If there is a reason that's in your context to have taxes separated out, then yes, you could separate those into two items on your voucher. But if there's no implication, if you don't need to report that to any government body, if no one's ever going to want to see the taxes separated, then you can just put the full amount. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good question.
You may cover this later, but question about petty cash. Can you just clarify what is petty cash?
Sure. So petty cash is, or you would call it your cash account. Petty cash are the funds that you have on hand to be making payments from a project that you cannot make through other means. So there are still, especially when you're out in the field doing project implementation, many of the expenses that we're going to incur cannot be done with plastic, right? Or that can't be done with checks or any of those other forms of payment. So you, generally speaking, would have a petty cash account, or you would have a safe or a cash box that would hold the cash. You would withdraw that from your bank account, and you would then account for that and do bookkeeping on that cash as a cash account. Okay, so you would still be keeping, doing vouchers and recording the expenses that you paid out, and you would have an opening balance of the amount that you withdrew from your bank account, and you would have a closing balance of the cash that is still on hand or still in the cash box at the end of that financial period. Okay, so you almost, I think a way to think of it is wherever you store your cash, the petty cash, think of that as being like a bank account. Okay, it's just a cash account, but you still have to do the same bookkeeping exercise as if it's a bank, right? Wherever the money is being kept, you still need to do the same process of recording expenses that come out from that source. A question here about VAT in Canada or to get a refund. Yes, we do. This is from Toyin. We do pay sales tax in Canada, and there is for charities that are registered with the Canadian government, we are able to claim back part of the sales tax that we spend. So we have to account for the sales tax amounts as separate line items in all of our bookkeeping. And then every 6 months, we can fill out a form. We send it to the government showing how much sales tax we've paid, and we are reimbursed for part of that.
Okay, one final question for now is how do you like to organize your voucher tracking by project versus by organization? So do you like to keep one set of vouchers for one project? And if you're doing something that kind of runs across multiple projects, like transportation, for example, takes like project officers to a site to look at 2 projects, say.
Yep.
How would you track those and then make sure that they're accounted for within the context of a project budget?
Yeah. Okay, so to the first part of the question, I would not keep separate vouchers for separate projects, okay? The vouchers and your bookkeeping system really relate to your bank accounts, okay, and your cash account. So regardless of what project you're using, you should be able to fill out the same vouchers, okay? On the voucher, you can see here where I'm pointing with the cursor. There is a column there, and there should be on yours. If you look at your organization's existing tools, you should have a place where you are able to indicate budget code, okay? And this would be where you would indicate which project that expense is coming from. And you probably even are going to add additional details. So it might be, project 1, but then the budget code transportation. You might have different ways of coding it with numbers or words that you can do that however makes sense for your organization. But each expense should be coded to the appropriate project and the appropriate budget line for that project. Okay, so if in the example that was in the question say you have a transportation expense and you travel to a place where you're going to be monitoring 2 projects at the same time, you could put in your description of expense the travel, right? And then you could put both budget oops, sorry, I clicked. You could also put, you could split that transportation amount and allocate half to one project and half to the other project simply by how you enter it here. Okay, so you could put transportation to community X, you put budget code 1, budget code 2, and you would take the amount and split it in half. So if you spent 100, you could say 50 for project 1 and 50 for project 2. Okay. Does that answer the question? Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Thank you. Yeah, go on.
So from the vouchers, we then go to a check or a payment requisition. So this, I think, can seem a little bit like duplication of effort, but this is the process that you use to pay out or reimburse for expenses. Okay, so the voucher is itemizing the expenses and telling us which project and which budget those expenses should come from. The check or payment requisition is about who is being paid. Okay, and who is being reimbursed. So this is what's used to request, and it usually indicates how that payment is being made, whether it's by check, or in some cases you might be doing a wire transfer or an electronic transfer or a mobile transfer, depending on how you manage your finances. Okay, each one of these check or payment requisition essentially goes along with a payment voucher. Okay, so if you think of it as a stack of paper that would be attached, you would have a check or payment requisition. Underneath that is the voucher that you filled out, and behind that are all of the receipts or documentation that go along with that voucher. Okay, these usually need to be signed off by some sort of authorized individual within an organization. Generally speaking, organizations will have certain individuals who are designated as their financial authority, who have the ability to sign on behalf of the organization. These would usually be the same people who are able to access the bank account for the organization, right? So you might have two people, it could be staff, it could be board members, it could be lead volunteers who are able to sign documents, who are able to access funds from the bank account. Those individuals should be the same people who are signing off on signing checks, if there are checks to be signed, or actually doing the issuance of payments and signing off on these payment requisitions. Okay, so for example, in Canada, our organization, CAP Network, like all Canadian NGOs, all checks and payments require two signatures. So myself and Katie, we might fill out the voucher and submit the payment requisition, and we have to send that to someone else who signs off before we're able to make the payment, because it requires two people to sign. That might not be the case where you are. You might only need one signature, but you should make sure that your organization's policy around that is in line with the government recommendations for NGOs or CBOs where you live. Okay. So this is a sample of a check requisition. Okay, you'll notice that this is there is a place there to write the voucher number, so that in case documents get separated, you know that they go together, right? The voucher and the check or payment requisition. Again, it has the budget code and description of expenses, okay? And then it has prepared by, verified by, and approved by. Okay, same as before. This is the section that is the most important here, because this is saying who that payment is being made to. And that could be the payment has been made to a vendor that you are paying directly. It could be that you're paying salary to an individual. So then that would be the individual volunteer or staff person's name. It could also, and I think is very common, be an individual who's being reimbursed for expenses that they already incurred, right? So I might go to a store to buy stationery for the office, and then I would bring the receipt back and I would be reimbursed for that expense. So then that would be payable to me. Okay. So the check, this is also an important note. So there may be more than one check or payment requisition associated with a voucher. Okay. So one voucher might cover all of the, say, all of the salaries that are being paid for the month of October. Okay. And you might fill out your bookkeep, whoever's doing the bookkeeping might fill out one voucher saying we're paying all of these individuals for their salaries. And that could be on one voucher. But if there are 4 people being paid salary, then there would be 4 payment vouchers, because the payment vouchers are about who is being paid. And the voucher is about what is being paid, the expenses as relates to the project budget or organization budget. That part makes sense? Okay, couple of thumbs up. Suleiman.
Yes, yes, but actually, what are the difference between the request for payment form and the check requisition form? What are the difference?
So a check requisition or a payment requisition are the same thing, okay? We call them, I'm still maybe stuck in the past a little bit, we call them check requisitions, but it may be that you're paying by electronic transfer. It may be that you're paying with cash. That's fine. It's it's a payment requisition, which is about who is being paid. And that is just important notice that that is different from the voucher, which is recording what the expenses were. Okay. I probably should update this to say check or payment requisition, because we don't all use checks anymore. It's a bit old-fashioned, really. Okay. Seeing any other questions on the requisition? So the next form of requisition is an advance, and this would usually be a cash advance. This would be the form or the tool that you would use to document when you are releasing cash to an individual that they, for the intention of using that to pay expenses for the project, okay? So this might be, I think the most obvious example is somebody is going to be traveling to the field, to a community where they're going to be doing some work there. They're going to need cash to pay for their transportation. They need cash to pay for food. They need cash for any supplies or payments they're going to make while they're there in the field. So the cash advance requisition would include the estimate for how much they anticipate they will be spending on those items. Okay, and then the cash, this is the form that would then allow you to release the cash that they're going to need to make those payments. Okay. Once those cash payments are made, this requisition can will be attached to the voucher that they ultimately submit. Okay, so you will still collect receipts and documentation for the payments that are made. Okay. And then those will be reconciled with versus what you were anticipating, the cash that you took with you versus what you actually spent. May not be exactly the same, okay? So this is an example of a cash advance requisition, okay? Same, you wouldn't know the voucher number at the beginning, but you would fill this in later when you get to the point of filling out the voucher. You've got the date, you've got the place to put the name of the person who's being issued the cash, okay? You have a place for the budget code, place for the description of the planned expenses. And then here in this column here is where you would put the expected amount, okay? So that's the amount of cash that is being requested, and you have a total here. And that would be the amount of cash that would be released to that individual, okay? So you would, whoever prepared it, usually the person who's requesting the cash would be filling this out. It would be verified by someone, and there would be a signature here by the individual confirming that they have received that cash, okay? That's really important that to have that record, especially like when you're dealing with cash, right? You want to have somewhere that indicates there's somebody has signed to say, yes, I have received this cash, all right? And once they've signed to say that they've received the cash, they are now accountable for that cash, right? And either returning the cash or providing documentation or receipts to show how they spent that cash for the project or for the organization. Okay. Once those expenses have been incurred, this form would be completed with the actual amount spent on each of those anticipated items. So if you had a description of planned expenses for transportation, you expected to spend 100, you actually spent 80. So you would put 80 in the actual amount, okay? And this then would have a total at the bottom. If these totals don't match, right, then there should be an amount of cash that is returned. So if you didn't spend as much as you thought you were going to spend, then you would be returning the cash along with this completed cash updated requisition form. So that money then goes back into the petty cash or your cash box, okay? That again has a place to say received by, okay? So whoever is in charge of the petty cash, whoever holds that cash box would sign to say, yes, I have received 20 back, okay? And put it back in the cash account. This is probably a form that even if you are not the individual in your organization that is responsible for bookkeeping, this is the kind of form that you probably, as someone who works in the project, would be needing to fill out, right? This is one that field staff or volunteers would use quite a lot because this is about the day-to-day spending in implementing a project.
Claire, could you just confirm same process if you need to reimburse somebody by e-transfer?
Sorry? Yep.
For reimbursing by e-transfer.
If you have advanced funds to them by e-transfer, yeah. And so, yeah, you might be in a situation where you're not working with cash, but you may have an advance requisition and you may provide the advance by e-transfer or electronic transfer or mobile transfer. You may receive extra back through e-transfer or mobile transfer. I would say for simplicity, and so avoid too much confusion, I would suggest that you follow the practice of however the funds are advanced, that is also how funds are returned. I think it can get very confusing if you're advancing funds out of cash and receiving funds back by e-transfer. That makes it a lot more confusing to account for in your bookkeeping, okay? So if you're advancing cash, then it should be cash that is returned. And if you're advancing by e-transfer, then you should receive the funds, any leftover funds, closing balance back by e-transfer.
Keep it consistent. Thank you. And then the suggestion from Mark, all the forms that require budget codes should have the codes printed on the back of the form.
That's a really excellent idea. Yeah. So that way you have a place to refer to figure out which budget code you need, because you might not have memorized all of the budget codes for each project. The last sort of piece of the bookkeeping process are the ledgers. Okay. Now, if you are not going to be, or if you are not the person at your organization, in your group that is responsible for bookkeeping, you probably will not have to work with a ledger, okay? So, but you should still be aware of what they are and be aware of what happens once you have filled out these forms, right? So how does this all come together? It all comes together in something called a ledger. Now, a lot of us are at this point probably using some sort of computer software that manages our ledgers for us. So you might be using an accounting software like QuickBooks, or I'm not sure which ones are sort of the most common where you are. But if you are not using an accounting software, you can still maintain project ledgers or organizational ledgers using Excel. And we have a template I believe somebody, I think Irfan, this is I think what you were referring to, where you're itemizing it using Excel. We have a template on file at Cap Network that we can share with you for how to set up, which is a ledger that is set up in Excel that you can use to manage your bookkeeping if that's of use to you. Okay, and either I think is fine. When you are managing donor funds, so I would suggest, if it's very large amounts of money, it's probably going to make your life easier to have a software accounting system that you use. But for most of us, for the scale of the work that we're doing, we can very easily, I think, manage that amount of funds, that volume of transactions using an Excel ledger. And most funders and most funding partners are going to be quite happy to see that, so long as everything is verified and so long as everything has proper documentation and so long as everything does reconcile at the end of each financial period. Okay. So ledgers are the place that record all credits and debits. So every transaction that is listed on a voucher ultimately is going to get entered into a ledger. Okay. You may have separate ledgers for each project, but those should ultimately roll up into a ledger that is for your bank account or for your cash account. Okay. So ultimately, what you're going to be looking to be able to do is to reconcile your bank ledger against the transaction report that you would receive from your bank, say at the end of every month or at the end of every quarter. Okay. My suggestion, if you're setting up a ledger, is to set up a bank ledger and then potentially to set up separate cash accounts for each project. Okay. But depending on how many projects you have, depending on the size of your projects, you might just want to have a bank ledger and a cash ledger, and just be very careful about recording those budget codes so that you can pull that information to look at the financial picture for each individual project.
So do we have two different ledgers then? Like how does that look?
At the very least, you'll have two. So at the very least, you should have a bank ledger and a cash ledger, assuming you are using cash in your day-to-day spending. Okay. If you have a requirement, so if you have a funder that has given you a large amount of money, they might actually have a requirement that you keep a separate project, a separate ledger, or even a separate account for that project. You can often when they say you need a separate account, they don't actually mean a separate bank account, but they mean an accounting account that is separate for that project, in which case you'd want to have a ledger just for that project as well. Is that clear, Grace? Sort of? Feel free to ask a follow-up.
Yeah, it's clear. It's just I'm not very familiar with Excel and all that. So I'm just wondering, do you have to then do them like two different pages on an Excel sheet? Or?
That's correct. That's exactly right, Grace. Yeah. So each ledger would be a separate tab or separate page within Excel. And I think we're making really good time. So why don't I suggest that when we get through these items on the slides, let's look at a ledger in Excel so that you can see what that might look like. Okay.
That'd be great.
Couple of questions in the chat too. Can you see those, Claire?
Oh, yeah.
Where do we fill or put account codes? The form has budget code only. And then second question, do the ledgers also match expenses against the budget?
Okay, good questions. So depending on how you have set up, budget codes and account codes might be interchangeable. It might just be a different term. I'm using budget codes. You might be talking about account codes. They might be the same thing. So you might be looking at a project budget, but the budget line matches an account code. It might be that you have both. Okay, so it only has one space on there because each organization sort of manages that differently. Okay, so generally what if you use both, then I would add a column if that's useful for you to have both. Or I also have seen that you might have, say, an account code, which is that project account. Say it's project 1, right? So the account code is 1, and then you might have a dash, and then you have O2 because it's the second, but it's budget line 2 from that project. So that's something that you can customize to whatever makes sense for your own internal organization. And certainly the templates that we have are actually done in Excel. So if you want to add a column, and then you could print out and have 2 columns, one for account, one for budget code, if that's helpful. And for Mark's question, do the ledgers also match expenses against the budget? They should. So the budget codes that you have, should match what is in your budget so that you can do a reconciliation of expenses for your project budget. And actually the second part, part 2 of this financial management training is going to be on exactly that, which is not how, now that you've got your bookkeeping system in place, how do you track expenses against a project budget and manage the financial picture for each project, which is separate from how you manage your overall finances for your organization, right? In the most simple sense, if you are a group that has come together to implement one project and all of your work is under one project, it makes it really easy. But if you are an organization that has 2 projects or 3 projects or 4 projects, you have to have your internal organizational bookkeeping system in place, but you also need to be able to manage the budgets for each of those individual projects, right? So that's what we're going to cover. I think it's in 4 weeks' time. Is that correct, Katie? Because we have our AGM in between. Is that right?
Yeah, 4 weeks.
Yep.
On to your question now, Grace. What are the standards for creating a budget code? Maybe it differs by organization, but how do organizations go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, usually they use number codes. You might use words. So you might have, I know, for example, I can speak to CAP Network. You know, we have numbered codes for accounts in our system, which are attributed to each project has its own account. But then we just use words. So we have a transportation budget, we have a personnel budget, administration budget. So for us, it might be account code 450 - transportation. Yeah. But you might have maybe transportation is represented by the number 2 in your organization. So it would be 450-2 for transportation. It's really up to you. I mean, I don't know that I have a preference. I think maybe I find using the words, if there are some things like materials, transportation, personnel, though, I think it's probably easier for people to keep track in their mind. But if you follow Mark's advice and you have those codes, a cheat sheet of those codes, even just printed right onto the ledger, the vouchers, then you can really do whatever is going to be easiest or whatever makes sense to the person doing the bookkeeping. And then everyone can use the cheat sheet to find the codes when they need them.
The question is, when we're recording the cash book, how we produce the reports, like income and expenditure, BFA, and the other reports.
How do you produce the reports that you need in Excel? And are you speaking about project reports?
Yes. For example, the donor reports or quarterly reports or monthly reports of income and expenditure, and also the the other financial reports.
Okay. So we're going to look at that. And when we're looking at, we're going to look at that right now, actually looking at a sample ledger. And then as I said to Grace, I will then show you a working version of a Excel-based ledger, so you can see how that can work. Okay. And to show sort of a roll up of expenses or a report against a project. And then in 4 weeks time, we're going to go really in depth about budget tracking and how to manage the budget for a particular project and how to sort of show and report against planned budget versus actual in a financial report. Okay. So if you can bear with me, I think we'll cover the answers to your question as we go through today, and then anything remaining, I think probably will be covered in the next session. Okay, so here's just a little snapshot of a sample bank ledger. Now this one's very simple. It only had 2 actual transactions, or sorry, 3 transactions in the financial period. And so you can see here, it has an opening balance and a closing balance line, okay? The opening balance is here. Funds received are credit. That means revenue, okay, that came in, and the balance goes up. There was a withdrawal into the cash account, and the balance goes down. PO salary, so project offer salary was paid for. You can see it refers to the budget, and then that was paid by check. And that is again a debit or an expense out of the account. Okay. And then you come to the end of the period and there's the closing balance. Okay. So that's what it looks like once it's in a ledger. If you're using an accounting software, you would enter your expenses per how that software asks you to do it, and it will produce this ledger for you. If you're doing it in Excel, here's a sample of what that can look like. Of course, this PO, this line here, the project officer salary voucher number 18, that would have a payment voucher. It would have a journal voucher or an expense voucher listed as well that itemizes all of that. It was payment of salary. Okay, and it would be signed off by that individual, the project officer, to say that they received that payment.
So Claire, if we could just duplicate this sample, for instance, and just label it as a project ledger, right? So we could just duplicate it, but rename it as a project ledger.
Yep, you could have different tabs that are by the different projects as well. Yep. Yep. You can also, so that's if you have a funding partner or a stakeholder working on the project that requires you to keep a separate ledger, you can do that. Okay, most don't. I can tell you for CAP Network, we don't require any of our partners to keep a separate ledger of only CAP Network project expenses, but we do require financial reports. Okay, but financial reports can be done without keeping a separate ledger using the budget lines. And especially if you're using Excel, then what you can do is set up a report, and I will show you this in a few minutes, that just rolls up only the transactions that are that have that budget line. Okay, I'll show you how to do that, Mark.
So in some countries, a part of salaries are taxes that go directly to the government. So that would be a different expense here, not included in the PO salary line.
Yeah, so in this case, there was none. Yeah, but you're right. In some cases, when you're paying salary, you might also be paying something to the government towards pension or that, depending on where you live, and that would be a separate transaction on all levels, right? So it would be a separate line on the voucher. It would be a separate line on the payment requisition. It would be a separate line in your ledger, with a bit separate budget line, most likely. Yeah. Okay. So this is an example of a cash ledger. Okay. And this cash ledger is related to the bank ledger. So you'll see here on January 3rd, there was a cash withdrawal from the bank account of 1,000, okay? And in the cash ledger, you see that there was a cash withdrawal from the bank, and that becomes a credit into your cash, okay? It's a debit from your bank and a credit into your cash account. So it's accounted for. This is the double entry. So you're accounting for it leaving your bank and entering your cash box. And now you can then track how that cash is spent using your cash ledger. Okay. We treat the cash box as if it's an account, right? A bank account. So you still have your opening balance. So that's the amount that was in your cash box at the beginning of the financial period. You got the credit of 1,000 that was withdrawn from the bank and put into your cash box. So the balance goes up. And then you have a cash payment out of the cash for office supplies, and that is debited from the cash account. And you have a closing balance of 3,500. Okay. The main thing there that I wanted to show you is that there is a relationship between your bank ledger and your cash ledger, okay? So whenever there's a withdrawal of cash, it should be seen as a debit in your bank ledger and seen as a credit in your cash ledger, okay? We don't want money to get lost in between. Okay. So in the package that Katie sent you, there were these templates. I think she shared these templates with you. So here's an opportunity if you wanted to try to fill out one of these, if you've not seen these kind of vouchers, if you've not worked with this before, if you want to try filling one of these out, now would be a time you could do that. And then we could answer any questions or that you come across while you try to do that. In the meantime, I'm going to find a good sample working Excel ledger that I can share with you on screen here so that you can see what that looks like when it all comes together.
So for this sample, we need 2 of the documents, correct? We have to fill in the check requisition and the journal voucher.
Yes.
A lot of work.
My last project, I did all this paperwork in an Excel sheet, and it was all lined up. The only time I had people signing things is when I gave money or when they were returning money. So that was the only actual hard copy paperwork being done aside from actual receipts. So because there's a lot of duplication in these forms that if you set it up on Excel, it's all there and you can just keep adding columns in depending on what you need. So it could make life a little bit easier if you can operate that way.
Yeah, if you can do things digitally. Now, how did you account for, how did you maintain the records of all of the receipts or invoices that would be associated with a payment?
So I got the receipts from people. I also later scanned them all, so I had a copy of them because I had to then give them to our accountant, but I wanted to make sure I had my own personal record. So that's the way I dealt with them. And then when someone gave me a receipt for something that they paid for, that was allowed because everyone had to get permission before they paid for something. Usually people paid for things first and then we did the paperwork. They didn't come to me and say, hey, I need $10 for some paper. It was they bought the paper and then I'd say, and then they say, can I buy the paper? Yeah, go ahead. So the orders got changed, but I have to make sure that I was aware of everything that was being paid out, which didn't always happen.
Right. Okay. Okay. So the only thing I would say to that, I think it's fine to do everything, as I said, digitally or in Excel. The only thing that I would say is that there should still be a numbering system in place. So that way, when you're, because you will have paper files, right? Somewhere, and in those paper files, you should be able to find some sort of number or code that will allow you to know that those paper files correspond with a particular payment voucher, or even if it is digital or in Excel, as you say, Mark.
Yeah, and that was part of the Excel program to create those numbers and put them on the receipts.
Okay.
And then the files that I scanned, they also embedded the code into the name of the file.
Okay. Makes sense. No. Prerine, could you just, could you give me permission to just share on screen what a ledger report from CPM on the SANI project looks like?
Yes, Claire, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Can everybody see the account ledger on the screen now? Yes? Yep. Okay. So this looks similar to the one that I've just shown you. Okay. So this is a ledger that was showing the local currency account for a project partner that we were working with in Zambia. Prerine here is the project officer who was responsible for this. So thank you again, Prerine, for letting us take a look at your work here. And you can see they've got the date in the ledger. You've got the voucher number. Okay. You've got the description of the work. Okay, you've got here the closing balance here. But what I wanted to show you is that we also have here this expense summary by budget line. This is the project report, like budget report. Okay, so this is the report that is rolling up all of the expenses for that project, that period, based on the budget line for the project. Okay. And all this is because it's in Excel. If you look here, there's a formula that is pulling rolling up the numbers from the account ledger. Okay, and so Grace, this is, I think, to the question that you were asking. Yes, so in this case, Cap Network was basically the funding partner. Well, we weren't. The funds were coming from someone else, but we required a report, say every month on that month's expenses. But Prerine didn't actually have to do any work to create this report because all she needed to do was update the ledger. And if she put the budget line over here in this column here, and column H is where she entered which budget line that expense was coming from. And then this tab here, we set up so that it automatically updated from the ledger. Am I making myself clear? Yeah. Now, if you're using an accounting software, you can pull a report for each budget line or each account and do the same thing. If you're using Excel, you just have to use these Excel formulas to set up the expense report or the roll up of your expenses into whatever view you need to see. And that's part of the support that Cap Network can offer. So if you're in a project or a partner that's affiliated with the network, that's the kind of thing that I can help you do, depending on how you need to be able to look at your information. And we'll talk about this again in 4 weeks' time when we look at budget reporting. Okay. I'm actually, I am actually a big fan of doing things in Excel for this reason. Unless you're dealing with really large amounts of money or you have a requirement by a funder to be using an accounting software, I think doing things in Excel on a reasonable scale is actually a good way to do it because it gives you so much flexibility. because you can determine how you want to look at your information and how you want to set up your formulas accordingly. Sometimes I find doing NGO project work and using formal accounting software, it's generally set up for businesses which operate a little bit differently, right? And are going to be reporting on and looking to look at reports a little bit differently than the way we want to look at them. So I find that even when organizations are using accounting software, it's fairly common that they have a secondary system in Excel that they're using to be able to report to funders, because sometimes accounting software just doesn't pull things together quite in the way that makes sense for our funding partners, right? Yes, Mark.
I had a funder that required reporting differently, and so I had to do a double bookkeeping system for them. That was crazy.
Mm-hmm. And they actually required a separate ledger, separate accounting system for their particular project.
Not the way I would have done it, but I was in China and I had no choice but to try to follow what they suggested.
Yeah. Yeah, that's always fun, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. So hopefully, if you're able to do use Excel, then that's the kind of thing that we can help sort of set things up in the different views that you need to see. And if you do have a funding partner, or sometimes it's government stakeholders or local partners even that you're working collaboratively with on a project, if they have a particular way they want you to report on the finances, then if you are in Excel, we can set that up using formulas so you can have multiple views of your finances, all but really only one place that you're actually doing the work of entering numbers. Okay. For anybody who wants to do this exercise, I think you have all of the, I've got a second one here that's looking at the other forms, the cash advance and corresponding voucher. If you have the time this afternoon or this morning, wherever you're sitting in the world, to do this, I would suggest doing that now while the information is fresh so you can go through the process. I know I find that actually doing something helps it to stick in my mind better than having just heard someone talk about it. So if you are new to bookkeeping, you're new to using these kinds of tools, please do take the time to go through these exercises. And if you have any questions, or if you would like us to look at it and just give you the thumbs up that, yep, that's exactly right, Katie and I are available by email and are quite happy to do that or answer any follow-up questions you have after giving it a go on your own, okay?
But this is just so timely. We're just at that point where I'm just doing a project and getting in. And it's so hard because I have a volunteer who does bookkeeping for me when it wasn't a lot of work. But now, because I really need to put in the day-to-day details, I was really starting to get frustrated. I'll put it in my Excel and I'm like, I don't like numbers. So but I just needed this sort of clarification. This is so helpful just to know the tools that I can use and how to be able to use those tools. It's demystified it for me. Thank you.
Awesome. You're very welcome, Grace.
Just if you have an accountant that you pay to prepare your annual tax return, so this would be for a registered charity, can I claim that expenditure from the government?
That would entirely depend on the local context and the governing rules in where you live around NGOs and CBOs. I know I've never heard of that with the partners that I've worked with. I don't think that's ever been something that could be claimed. Certainly, it is something that can be claimed from a funder if they're requiring an audit. Then usually a funder should be able to have that be an allowable expense from for a project if you are required to have an audit, or if they require a professional accountant to prepare financial statements, for example. But other than that, in terms of being able to be reimbursed from the government, that's not something I've ever heard of, but that doesn't mean it's not the case in countries that I'm just not familiar with. Sorry.